So this week I'm also going to briefly discuss qualitative research with you. So qualitative research is also commonly used in education, but it uses designs and datas and collection methods that are different from some of the quantitative research. So, sort of just to give you a comparison, if those of you are interested in qualitative data, um, you have couple of different chapters in your text. Sorry, this is a typo here. It says page 15, but you had that first chapter that we read about sort of the comparison between quantitative and qualitative, which tells you, a couple of the different differences between these two methods of choice. So we talked about qualitative versus quantitative data in terms of the problem statement, purpose statement, and literature review earlier in this summer session. So now we can look at what it looks like to select participants for a research study. So with quantitative data, we know that you look at specific narrow focuses and that you use numerical data. So you need something that you can measure. With qualitative data, you are generally focused pretty broadly and you're looking for participants based on a particular set of experiences that they have. So for my dissertation study, for example, I was really looking for special education teachers who worked in large urban districts and who had something to say about the fact that they had stayed in these districts for a long time. So I was looking for those who had, multiple years of teaching experience in the district. And so that was important to me as I did a qualitative study. Now, when you go out and collect data for your study, you have also the differences of qualitative, quantitative data here as well. So with quantitative data, you use some sort of predetermined instruments. So you might use a setup survey, you might use a questionnaire, you might use a particular intervention that's already kind of been laid out. And you're, again, primarily dealing with a large sample and numbers. And sort of the only exception to that for quantitative would be the single subject design, which is predominantly used in special education. And so this design is usually used if you are using just one particular subject, and then you're doing a series of intensive intervention or observations with that student. And I'll put up a resource PowerPoint for you for this particular type of design too. So those of you who are interested in single subject research can take a look at that if you would like some more information of how to set up your methods paper for our research proposal. But with qualitative data, as sort of in a contrast to this quantitative data, you have to decide how to gather your data after you start, and the protocols kind of tend to emerge. So a lot of the interview questions that you'll ask your participants tend to kind of come from the participants themselves. So like what you'll engage in sort of a conversation with them, and things might pop up that you want to ask that are not really scripted or part of the script. And this data is primarily very wordy. So, this is sort of that, are you more of a math person or are you more of an English person? And that kind of gives you as a person have this personality, and you have to decide, sort of what you feel most comfortable sort of dealing with in terms of your data. With qualitative data, you also have a very small sample size. So the participants that you use are going to be people that you get to know very, very in depth. And so you'll have a lot of like wordy data for these participants, and therefore you keep your sample sizes fairly small compared to quantitative data. So with quantitative data, it's not uncommon to have, numbers like 50, 100, if you're doing a long-term study, maybe thousands of participants, whereas with qualitative data, my participant size for my dissertation was 5 teachers. So it was very, very small in comparison. But again, I got to know those teachers very, very well. So very, very different style of collecting the data as well. Now, the way of analyzing or interpreting what you get from your data is also very different for quantitative versus qualitative. So with quantitative data, you typically are using statistics. So you're going to use a series of tests to see, if hypothesis that you had about this particular math method or this particular intervention was true. And then you compare groups and determine the relationships between these different groups. And you're comparing your results again with the hypothesis. So that's the main idea with your quantitative research. With your qualitative research, however, you're using again the words. So the text is the main part of analysis. So if you've ever, had to do sort of a book report or had to interpret a passage from a piece of literature, for instance, right? For like maybe an undergrad class, you had to do a book report or something. You'll remember that you have to kind of read between the lines when you're reading something like that. So, and that's the same for qualitative, excuse me. So you have to be engaged in description, analysis, and theme development. So just like I kind of asked you to do for your lit review, you come up with themes based on what you're finding from the literature. And when you do your own data analysis for qualitative, you're actually creating your own themes based on what the participants in your study said. So really, qualitative is concerned with the larger meaning. What is the bigger picture? What is the larger meaning of what you're gathering through your data? Now, when you report your data and when you're evaluating the research or when you're, kind of coming up with your findings and your results, this is where quantitative data usually use very standard and fixed procedures. It's usually thought of as very objective and unbiased. Whereas with qualitative, it's very much like an emerging process. It's very flexible, it's very interpretive, and then there's a degree of bias that's involved, and that's part and parcel of being a qualitative researcher. You know that people come into studies with bias, and you acknowledge and celebrate that. So there are differences there too between qualitative and quantitative. So a couple of key characteristics about qualitative research. So qualitative research questions problems that are usually not stated specifically up front. So you'll look at like a general area of interest and a sort of a foreshadowing problem or topic that is explored. And it's usually kept narrow in focus until, the research sort of takes place. So that's the way that it's really set up is to sort of look for these emerging trends, be more interpretive, and really get to know participants in depth. So the role of the literature review in qualitative research is really to establish the importance and also to see what others have done. But there's no really hypothesis as such. We're not doing a prediction the way that you do in quantitative research. Here you're just trying to learn more about the experiences or the lived experiences of particular individuals who you then call participants. They're not called subjects because they're participants in that they're participating in a series of interviews or observations. And most of this is purposive. So you will find people that, serve a particular purpose for the research. There really isn't this idea of random selection. The number of participants, as I said before, is usually small because it's very purposeful. There's a reason that you're choosing the people that you choose. In the data collection of qualitative research, data collection methods and the type of data collected are two of the main differences between quantitative and qualitative. Typically, with qualitative data, you use things like observations, interviews, videotapes, case studies, open-ended questions, and field notes, which we can talk about later in this presentation. So instead of stating a particular design at the beginning, sometimes there's what is called an emerging design. A design is going to change sometimes as data is collected and there's themes and patterns that start to become apparent. So they have particular approaches, however, rather than design. So for my dissertation study, I used case study research. You can also use what's called ethnography, where you kind of immerse yourself in a particular, setting of the study. So if it's a school, you kind of become part of that school. Like you set up camp there, for a couple of weeks, and you actually like, follow teachers around to different classrooms. You sort of become one with that particular school so that you really get like the insider's perspective. So that's ethnography is done a lot in the field of anthropology, where you go and study like a particular culture and stuff for a long period of time. So um, that's more very, very in-depth qualitative research. So we already kind of talked about the objectivity piece, but qualitative researchers really seek to learn from participants' perspectives. So as I said with the example of going into a school, right, you're trying to learn the perspectives of teachers or of students or of, people with disabilities. You may even take on the role of just being like kind of a casual observer as a participant. You even may like kind of immerse yourself in what's going on to sort of become more familiar with it. So it really does get a lot more in depth with the particular experience that it's studying. So, with my participants, I really try to get the idea of what it would mean to be a teacher in this particular district. And try to stay from year to year. So that was really my interest, was about their retention in this large district. So as I said before, there's different kinds of analysis that happen. So just like we were saying before, there isn't this like statistical analysis where you look at to see if the hypothesis was correct the way you do with quantitative data. With qualitative data, you're actually looking at observations or field notes or interviews, and then you analyze these for some themes and patterns that occur. So, you may collect a series of interviews from your participants by, going ahead and tape recording them or audio recording them. And then you play them back later and you kind of type out what you're thinking about or hearing. You may try to like type it all out word for word and then go back and like look to see what you've kind of learned from the participants. And that's where you'll create a series of themes. So you'll see some things coming up over and over. So for instance, I might, have seen this whole theme about, being, a young teacher, right? So I'll see like, a lot of teachers talk about their age, and then they'll make a pattern based off of that about, the age of the teacher. And then there'll be all these, representative quotes from the participants through their interviews about it. And then, it can kind of be constructed into this section of my dissertation. So here's just a couple of common approaches to qualitative research. So as I said, for my work, I usually do case study. That's where you sort of construct cases of individual participants. So each teacher that I worked with became sort of their own story, their own case. And I got to sort of in narrative form, just, describe who they were and then start looking for, patterns across the, 5 teachers that I worked with. I talked a little bit about ethnography, where you kind of immerse yourself into a particular culture or group or setting, such as a school. There's also a couple more. There's focus groups, there's phenomenology, and then there's grounded theory. So grounded theory, you can take any of the approaches with grounded theory, but it really focuses on this fact that you don't come into the research with some sort of theory, but you hope to develop a theory as you get out of the research. So that's what grounded theory is. Phenomenology refers to lived experiences and life experiences of the particular participant. So you're really getting an in-depth look at like the overall life of this particular person. There's also focus groups where you get a group of people together maybe and then have them like do a group interview, so you can kind of see how people feed off of each other's ideas. There's action research, which sort of has its own category. We talked a little bit about that before, but with action research, you're really trying to have the participants that you work with really get support. So, if there's like a common problem in schools, that has to do with behavior or fighting or something like that, you work collectively with the teachers to sort of solve that problem through the research. So a couple of the data collection methods, obviously one of them is observation. You can do, video observations, written reflections on observations. Participant observations mean you become a participant as they're observing. In non-participant, you don't participate in the particular thing happening. So you might not, for instance, participate in a school setting with the teachers or anything, but you remain sort of separate from the group. So very frequently people use interviews as a method. There's these interviews that are called unstructured, and then there's structured, and then there's also in-depth and semi-structured are another way of looking at it. So with interviews that are unstructured, there's no really set of questions, but it's more just sort of like a conversation that you would have just with somebody naturally. Whereas with a structured, you would have a more formal set of questions. Most people do what's called semi-structured, and that means that you have a set of questions that you kind of come up with, but then you're okay if like the conversation veers off a little bit and like goes into something a little more interesting, or like if you want to ask some follow-up questions that are not on the sheet that you provide your participants. So some people also do what's called examining existing records. So what they do is they might look at documents to see if they can analyze them. So if you were like a special ed teacher, for instance, you might look at like the IEPs of special education students to see if you can find some patterns across IEPs. I had a colleague who did this to look at like adults who had disabilities, and then she looked at like the transition records for adults who were like transitioning from high school to adulthood like jobs. Um, so you can do this for a variety of reasons. I have another master's student who's doing like initial referral IEPs. So she's looking at the IEPs to see, what sorts of behavior goals and like objectives they have for students with autism. So you could definitely do that too. You can look at existing records that exist and then analyze those as part of your data collection. Now, one thing that makes qualitative data a little bit stronger is what's called triangulation. So triangulation means that you're getting several sources and methods to verify your data. So really this means using different types of data. So if I'm using interviews, I want to back that information up with something else. So for my dissertation study, I used interviews, but then I also asked the participants to construct some journals. And so like I had them write in these journals like every couple of weeks. And this really made a difference in terms of, just getting another side to their stories about, their reasons for staying in special education. So if it didn't come out through us talking to each other, I could get it from their written word as well. This is sort of a cross-checking process. And triangulations, if you think of a triangle, it really means three. So typically you want to find like three different ways of getting it at the data. So, for some people that might be observations, interviews. For some that might be, focus groups, maybe journals, maybe, like giving them, some sort of written prompt, some sort of field notes. So field notes can also serve in this capacity where they, end up being like sort of your own reflections that get then put into the data analysis process. So there's different ways of doing the three different methods for collecting data. So one way of analyzing data is you can use what's called a constant comparison method. So it's comparing data as it's collected, and it's especially useful when you're using like a grounded theory where you're trying to create a theory. But you're looking at like things where you kind of compare across. So, as relationships and commonalities begin to appear, you can start using graphic organizers or charts. There's also a series of really cool software that's available if you decide to use something more high tech for this. But really, you can actually just use, a highlighter and start like kind of making your own, little buckets for different themes. So that's kind of how qualitative is set up. So let's do a quick self-check. What of the following are commonly used methods in qualitative research? Interviews, standardized tests, observations, questionnaires, or videotaping. There can be more than one answer, by the way. So with qualitative research, you can use interviews, as we were talking about, observations, questionnaires, which can be used in quantitative as well, but typically they're like more open-ended questionnaires, and then videotaping.